Story 1. Solo Camping Terror. A few years ago, I took a solo backpacking trip to a state park a few hours away from my hometown. I had been under a lot of stress lately. Work, family, all the usual stuff. So I figured some time alone in the wilderness would do me some good. I'm not a complete newbie to camping, but I'd never done an extended solo trip before. I packed up my gear, loaded up the car, and set off with a plan to camp for 3 nights deep in the park, where I could just get away from everything. The park was beautiful, with dense forests, winding trails, and the occasional clearing where you could catch glimpses of the surrounding mountains. I had a specific spot in mind that I'd found online, an area along a creek, miles away from any designated campsites. It was the perfect place for some quiet solitude, or so I thought. When I arrived, the parking lot at the trailhead was empty, just as I had hoped. After double-checking that I had all my supplies, I strapped on my backpack and began the hike. After walking for a few hours, I finally reached the spot I'd picked out. It was even more secluded than I expected. The creek ran clear and cold, and there was a small, flat area just a few yards from the water where I could set up my tent. Beyond that, the forest was thick and dark, and the trees were closely packed together. It felt like I had the entire world to myself. I set up camp quickly, tent, campfire, the whole setup. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, and the golden light made everything seem almost unreal, like a painting. After eating, I spent some time just sitting by the creek, letting the water run over my hands and staring up at the sky as it slowly turned from blue to orange. I could hear the distant chirps of crickets starting up, and for the first time in weeks, I felt completely at ease. As darkness fully settled in, I huddled by the fire to keep warm, and stayed up a little longer, enjoying the atmosphere around me. Around 10 p.m., the fire had burned down to embers, and I decided it was time to turn in. I crawled into my tent, zipped up the flap, and lay down on my sleeping pad. The sounds of the night, frogs, insects, the occasional owl, made my eyes heavy, and I soon began to fall asleep. At some point in the night, I woke up abruptly, unsure of what had stirred me. The fire outside had long since died, and my tent was plunged into almost complete darkness, except for the faint light of the moon filtering through the trees. I lay still, listening intently. The woods had grown eerily quiet. No more frogs, no more insects. Just silence. I strained to hear, trying to convince myself that it was nothing, probably just the natural quiet of the woods late at night. But then, I heard something. A soft, deliberate crunch of leaves, followed by another, and then another. Someone, or something, was walking just outside my tent. My heart started to race. I hadn't seen another person since I left the trailhead, and I was miles away from any official campsites. I sat up slowly, careful not to make any noise, and listened again. The footsteps were circling the tent now, slowly, like whoever it was knew I was inside but wasn't sure if I was awake. I held my breath, my mind racing with every possible scenario. Should I call out? Should I grab something to defend myself? My knife was in my backpack, which was on the other side of the tent. I could reach it, but if I made a move, whoever was out there would definitely hear me. I waited, my body frozen with fear, as the footsteps grew closer. They stopped just outside the entrance to my tent. I stared at the zipper, half expecting it to start moving, half praying that whoever it was would just leave. But instead of opening the tent, the person, or thing, just stood there, motionless. I could feel their presence just inches away from me, separated only by the thin fabric of the tent. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. My mind was racing, trying to figure out who could be out here. No one should be this far out, especially at this time of night. Then, suddenly, I heard a faint whisper. It wasn't loud enough for me to make out the words, but it was unmistakably a voice, low and raspy, as if whoever was out there was speaking to themselves, or worse, to me. My heart was pounding as the whispering continued, then slowly faded as the footsteps began again, this time moving away from the tent. I listened, hardly daring to breathe, as the sound of the footsteps grew fainter and fainter, until eventually they were gone. I didn't move for what felt like hours, terrified that if I made any noise, the stranger would come back. Finally, when the first light of dawn began to come up over the horizon, I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and stepped outside. The campsite looked exactly as I'd left it. Nothing out of place, no signs of anyone having been there. But when I looked at the ground around the tent, my stomach dropped. There were footprints, large human footprints, circling my tent multiple times. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, my hands shaking the entire time. I didn't even bother to eat breakfast. I just wanted to get out of there, to get back to the safety of my car and away from whatever had been out there with me that night. The hike back to the trailhead was the longest 3 hours of my life. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me, but the trail remained empty. When I finally reached the parking lot, I practically ran to my car, threw my gear in the back, and sped out of there without looking back. To this day, I have no idea who or what was outside my tent that night, but I've never been camping alone since, and I don't think I ever will again. Story 2. Surrounded. A few years ago, I had an eerie encounter while camping alone in Oregon. I haven't camped much since then, but during that time, I was an avid solo camper. I cherished the feeling of being immersed in nature with no one around. It was my way of recharging after long weeks, and I would often set out on weekends for short trips to explore different parts of the state. I'd bring my dog sometimes, but on this trip, it was just me. I had recently purchased a larger tent with a proper cot because, like most campers, I wasn't a huge fan of sleeping on the cold, hard ground. This trip was supposed to be a relaxing 2-night stay at a remote camping spot I had found in a national forest, about 4 hours from home. The place was deep enough into the woods that I was unlikely to run into any other campers, which was fine with me. I could pull right into the spot as well with my car and wouldn't have to do any heavy hiking. That was a definite plus. The first day went just as planned. I arrived in the late afternoon, set up camp, and did a bit of exploring. The area was stunning. Thick pine forests, a crystal-clear stream nearby, and lots of peace and quiet. I spent the early evening making dinner over the campfire and watched the last light of the day fade from the sky. As night fell, I sat in my camp chair, leaning back and gazing at the stars. At some point, probably around 11 p.m., I heard something in the woods behind me. At first, I figured it was some animal, maybe a deer or raccoon. But then I heard what sounded like snapping twigs, the kind of sound that usually comes from something larger moving through the brush. I paused and listened intently. It was dark, with only the glow of my campfire providing any light. Even though I didn't feel immediately alarmed, I was definitely alert. I reached over, grabbed my flashlight, and pointed it in the direction of the sound. The light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and shrubs. I didn't see anything unusual, so I brushed it off and went back to stargazing. A few minutes later, I heard it again, this time closer. The rustling and snapping twigs returned, this time accompanied by the faintest sound of what might have been breathing. It was difficult to be sure with the crackling of the campfire and the stillness of the night. I stood up this time, shining my flashlight deeper into the woods. "Hello?" I called out, trying not to sound nervous. No response. I stood there for a moment, my hand gripping the flashlight tightly, straining to hear anything else. But there was only silence. After a minute or two, I sat back down, though the comfort I had felt earlier had slipped away. My eyes kept darting toward the woods, and I no longer had any interest in staring at the stars above me. Instead, I focused on the sounds around me, trying to convince myself it was just an animal. I was about to call it a night, when the sounds from the woods became clearer. There was a sound of leaves and underbrush crunching. It was footsteps. My heart raced as I shot up from my chair, flashlight scanning the trees again, but I still didn't see anything. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to keep my voice steady. No answer. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything was still. Then, just as I was about to call out again, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. Something, or someone, had just ducked behind a tree, maybe 30 feet away. My pulse quickened. I stepped closer to my campfire, now painfully aware that I wasn't alone. "I can see you," I lied, hoping it might coax the person into revealing themselves. "What do you want?" No reply. I stood there, frozen for what felt like an eternity, waiting for something to happen. Then I heard footsteps again, this time moving in a slow, deliberate circle around my camp from the other side. There was someone, or something else. Whoever it was, they were just out of sight, pacing in the darkness. I began to shake, realizing that there were multiple sounds, coming from multiple directions. I don't know why I didn't pack up right then and there. Maybe I thought whoever it was would eventually move on. Maybe I didn't want to believe I was in any real danger. But the longer the footsteps circled, the more unnerved I became. It felt like I was being watched, studied, and toyed with. I decided to put out the fire, thinking that maybe if the light was gone, they would stop. I quickly doused it with water, watching the flames sizzle and die, plunging my campsite into near total darkness. Only my flashlight remained, and even that felt woefully inadequate. As soon as the fire was out, the footsteps stopped again. The silence was suffocating. I shone the flashlight around one last time, trying to spot any movement. Nothing. It was like whoever, or whatever, was out there had vanished. I stood there for what must have been 5 or 10 minutes, heart pounding, waiting for any sign of movement. But there was none. Only silence. I decided then that I wasn't going to wait for morning. I quickly started breaking down my camp, throwing everything haphazardly into the back of my car. My tent, my gear, my half-eaten food, all of it was packed up in a matter of minutes. I didn't care about organizing anything. I just wanted to get out of there. As I threw the last of my things into the car and walked around to the driver's door, I heard it again. The footsteps, this time moving rapidly toward me. My heart dropped as I fumbled with the keys, trying to get into my car. The sound of the footsteps was now unmistakably close, just a few yards away. I didn't wait to see who or what was coming. I jumped into the car, slammed it into reverse, and tore out of the campsite. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away from the woods. When I finally reached a more populated area, I pulled into a gas station and sat there for a while, trying to calm my nerves. I never found out who or what was in those woods that night. Maybe it was a few people messing with me. Maybe it was something else. Either way, I haven't camped alone since. I realized that being deep in the woods alone can be incredibly dangerous. You're isolated, and no one is around to help if something goes wrong. Out there, your screams would be swallowed by the vast, empty wilderness, leaving you truly on your own. Story 3. The Man in the Woods. I had been planning the trip for weeks, a solo weekend hike through a national forest I'd never been to before. It was supposed to be a quiet escape from my hectic life and a chance to reconnect with nature. I wasn't much of an adventurer, so I chose a trail that was relatively short and easy. About 5 miles in, there was a small clearing by a river that seemed perfect for setting up camp. I packed light, just the essentials: my tent, a sleeping bag, some food, and a flashlight. When I reached my spot, it was later in the evening, and there wasn't another soul in sight, which was exactly how I wanted it. I set up my tent close to a nearby river, and then sat by the bank for a while, watching the current. The peacefulness was so overwhelming that it almost made me forget I was miles away from the nearest road. After a quick meal of canned beans and bread, I decided to take a short walk around the area before the sun disappeared below the horizon. The woods felt still, the kind of stillness that makes everything seem frozen in time. I didn't stray too far from the camp, though. I didn't want to get lost, and the daylight was fading quickly. As I made my way back to the campsite, I noticed something strange. Across the river, about 50 yards away, there was a small wooden structure, a shack, almost hidden by the trees. I hadn't noticed it when I first arrived, probably because it blended in with the surroundings so well. It was old and decrepit, the wood dark with age, the roof caved in on one side. It didn't look like anyone had used it in years, but it still gave me an uneasy feeling, like I wasn't as alone as I had thought. I shook off the feeling and returned to my tent. The night came fast, and with it, an eerie stillness. The only sounds were the occasional croak of a frog or the distant hoot of an owl. I built a small fire and sat by it, staring into the flames. I tried to enjoy the quiet, but something felt off. Every once in a while, I found myself glancing over to the other side of the river, where that old shack was barely visible in the dark. I couldn't help but think about who might have built it, and why. As the night grew deeper, the fire started to die down, and I began to doze off in my chair. Just as I was about to drift into sleep, I heard something. A splash in the river, loud and sudden, like someone or something had jumped in. I sat up, instantly alert, my heart pounding. I stared out into the darkness, but I couldn't see anything beyond the faint glow of the embers. The water was calm again, completely still, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. Something was out there. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam across the river. For a moment, everything was quiet again, but then I saw it. Movement near the shack. A dark figure, just barely visible through the trees, was standing by the water's edge, watching me. I froze, my hand tightening around the flashlight. The figure didn't move, just stood there, almost blending into the shadows. My mind raced through possibilities. Was it another camper? A park ranger? Whoever it was, they weren't carrying any gear or lights, and their presence felt all wrong. I called out, my voice shaky. "Hello? Is someone there?" No answer. The figure didn't budge. I kept the light trained on it, waiting for some kind of response, but after what felt like an eternity, it slowly turned and disappeared back into the trees, leaving me staring at the empty riverbank. I didn't sleep much after that. I sat by the dying fire, the flashlight clutched in my hand, scanning the woods for any sign of movement. Every little sound made my heart race. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but the idea of walking back through 5 miles of dark forest didn't seem any better. I convinced myself it was just someone passing through, though deep down, I knew it didn't feel right. When the sun finally rose, I decided to stay put for the day. I was tired, but I didn't want to risk wandering around in case whoever I'd seen last night was still out there. I stayed by my tent, trying to keep myself busy, boiling some water for coffee, reading a book I'd brought with me. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Around midday, I heard footsteps approaching from the trees behind me. I turned, half expecting to see another hiker, but what stepped out of the woods made my blood run cold. It was the same figure I had seen the night before, only now I could make out more details. He was tall and thin, dressed in ragged clothes that looked as old as the shack across the river. His face was pale, gaunt, and expressionless, his eyes sunken into his skull. He stood at the edge of my camp, just staring at me. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest. "What do you want?" I shouted, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. He didn't respond. Instead, he took a slow step toward me, his eyes never leaving mine. My hands were shaking, and I instinctively reached for the small knife I had in my pack. Panic surged through me as I realized that this wasn't just a random hiker. I didn't know who he was or what he wanted, but I knew I had to get out of there. Without thinking, I bolted toward the river, my mind racing with thoughts of escape. I heard him behind me, his footsteps heavy and relentless, but I didn't dare look back. The water was freezing as I waded across the river, the current pulling at my legs. I stumbled, nearly falling, but somehow managed to reach the other side. I ran toward the shack, hoping I could find something, anything larger than the small knife I had, to defend myself. But when I got there, everything was boarded up. I had nowhere to go. The man was by the riverbank, and to my shock, he began to walk into the river, like he was coming after me. My chest heaved with exhaustion, and I felt my heart hammering in my chest. For a brief moment, I thought about hiding in the trees, but then, in the distance, I heard the faint sound of an engine, a car or a truck, maybe on a road that wasn't too far off. With one last burst of energy, I sprinted into the forest, away from the river, away from the shack, away from the figure who was now in the water. The sound of the engine grew louder, and eventually I stumbled out onto a narrow dirt road. 2 pickup trucks were stopped on the road, and 2 men were talking to each other. When they saw me, they looked very alarmed. I approached and practically collapsed as I explained what had happened. One of the men allowed me to climb into the bed of his pickup, and from there, we made our way out. I never went back for my things. Whoever that was in those woods, I wasn't going to find out. I had my keys, wallet, and phone, and that's all I needed. Everything else could be replaced. I never figured out who that man was or what he wanted, and frankly, I have no desire to find out. One thing's for sure, I'll never venture into those woods alone again.